For Session Update, I'm Shannon Lurkey. The Senate Republicans recently unveiled their legislative priorities for the 2016 session. Joining me in the studio to talk about those priorities with regard to education is Senator Sean Nienow. Welcome, Senator.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
So in the press conference, you spoke of empowering families and improving quality. I'd like to start with empowering families. What do you guys propose that could really empower families?
Well, they're currently in law. We do have some tax credits and tax deductions, but the scope of what those can be used for is relatively limited. One of the things we suggested is broadening that, not creating a new tax deduction, not creating a new tax credit, but broadening the use of the existing one and letting parents use that for tuition. So if they have a child that's in a school that's not working for them, which is very often the case, for example, in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where we have children that are dropping out and failing out at record rates, they can look at the possibility of using that tax credit, that tax deduction for tuition at a private school. Another item that we would have created, proposed, was education savings accounts. Essentially what that would be is the use of the existing money we spend on that child, the state, letting the parents put that into essentially it's a savings account. It's like a health savings account, but for education. And being able to use that for their child, for the education that that child needs. But it would be targeted to two categories that everyone understands are problematic. One, special needs. And second, at-risk children that are in schools that are not performing at par. So failing schools and at-risk children.
So the education savings account is just for those two groups?
Targeted to those two categories. That would become a win-win. We've all seen the numbers, and I hate to pick on them, but this is where the numbers are the worst. Minneapolis and St. Paul, particularly when you look at the demographic difference between white and minority students, particularly between white and black or white and American Indian students, the results there are abysmal for those two minority categories. And giving them the option to look at other educational choices, private schools, charter schools, etc., helping them make that affordable. And then when you look at special needs, schools will tell you all day long that they are cross-subsidizing. And so if a family's in a school that they don't believe is meeting their children's special needs, they can use that money, go into a specialized program that works better for them, and the school actually would save money.
So the schools work on per pupil funding,
yes,
as I understand. So if those tax dollars then are being diverted to charter schools or something else, what are the implications for the public schools as they exist now?
Well, in the case of children with special needs, school districts will unanimously tell you they spend more money on a child with special needs than they're given. So they're cross-subsidizing. So if that child were to utilize the money that we allocate for that child to go into a private program, the school would actually be saving money. In the case of at-risk children in schools that are not succeeding, the school would lose that money, but the child is probably destined to failure, and I don't think that's an outcome that we would want.
Right. So you also talked about quality results. What do you mean by quality results?
Well, another proposal that we had was targeting third grade reading proficiency. And this is actually a provision that is going to be in the omnibus bill that is before the Education Committee this week. It would require that all students by third grade are reading at grade, and if not, the school has to create a plan to get them to reading proficiency. The problem we have is between first and third grade, you're learning to read. From third grade on, you're reading to learn. And if you can't read, if you're not proficient in reading, you're going to fall further and further and further behind, and it's going to get more and more expensive and more difficult to get that child educated, and they're not on a path for success at that point.
Right, so then what do you do with those third grade students that are not reading at grade level? What's the plan then?
Well, there's no specific mandate. That is allowed, that decision is left to the schools, and they are allowed to have some flexibility in determining what that needs to look like. It's not specifically spelled out. What is required is that they create a plan for that child.
Now, you also said that you would like to reinstate the graduation requirements. Do you know why they were removed in the first place?
Well, I could speculate. They were removed because there were more votes to remove them than there were to keep them. But there's been a lot of discussion around testing and things like that, and that was some of the argument. But the reality is that the line that I like to use is when students go to school, they should learn things. And before we graduate them, we should know that they've retained what they've learned. And without those graduation standards, we don't know that. And the sad reality is that about 1 in every 3 children that go on to college, go on to higher education, not just 1 in 3 of every child, because not all children go to higher ed. Presumably the children that are going to higher education probably did a little better than children that are not. But 1 in 3 of those children going on to higher education need remedial classes, which means they can't read properly or they can't do math typically. One of those 2 categories. Those are 2 of the basics that we expect children to learn. You should be able to learn or read, and you should be able to do math before you graduate. But these children are going on to higher ed, going on to college, and 1 in 3 have to take remedial classes because they can't do it at the level they need to be doing it.
So does that mean that the graduation requirements would sort of set a bar so that then there would be kids who just don't graduate from high school?
Until they learn, unless there are mitigating circumstances. You know, if you have a child that has special needs, a child whose mental acuity is not typical, they may not be able to meet those standards, and there were provisions to allow for that. One anecdotal example of how this was making a difference before we repealed those laws, the gap between white and non-white students in math, for example, was horrendous. And when we implemented the graduation standard and said, you actually have to learn these things, the gap started to close. Now, I would say that's because we created an expectation and said, you will learn this. I don't care if you're black, blue, purple, or plaid, you can and you will learn this. That would be my explanation. Others would disagree, but when we created that standard and we started to apply it and said you need to learn this, that education gap started to close. And unfortunately then, we eliminated that grad standard.
So are you in favor at all of smaller class sizes or more tutoring? I mean, students have individual needs, there's different kinds of learners, and I think in the past there's been this moving people on, and that's why we kind of have this situation where kids aren't ready for college. They're going to college, but they're not quite ready for college. Class sizes are quite large. Is that something that the GOP is looking at also? Well,
you can have class sizes that are too large. And if you get past that point, you're going to have reduced results. But having a smaller class size in and of itself is not going to assure that you're going to have better results. So there's a sweet spot in that. And of course, we want to make sure that we're not getting beyond that. There's no question about that.
So are there any other education initiatives, maybe not for this session, but for the future that you and your party members are working on?
Well, I think we'll continue to look at those broad categories of empowering families, letting them have the option for educational choices that work best for them and for their children to get the best outcomes, looking at quality outcomes, ensuring that children, when they go to school, they learn. And before we graduate, we know that they've retained what they've learned and not just been able to pass a test on one day. And looking at those kinds of outcomes. Additionally, and we didn't touch on this, but another proposal that the GOP in the Senate put forth was to reduce some of the bureaucracy for schools, to have some reporting reduction. And that's actually another provision that's going to be in the omnibus bill that comes out this week and is going to get some discussion in the days to come. So we actually have had an influence and made a difference in what will probably be the final outcomes of this legislative session in education.
Senator Nienow, thank you for stopping by today.
Glad to be here.